The Sumerian tablets tell us that Inanna descended to the underworld to attend a funeral. They tell us she went to honour the death of Gulgulana, the bull of heaven, husband to her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. They tell us she prepared carefully, adorning herself with 7 divine powers before making the journey downward. And they tell us that when she failed to return, 2 creatures, neither male nor female, fashioned from the dirt beneath a god's fingernails, slipped past the gates like shadows and brought her back from death itself. But what if these aren't the imaginative embellishments of ancient storytellers? What if the tablets preserve something else entirely, a procedural record written with the precision of court documents, describing an actual event that occurred in a place the Sumerians understood to be as real as the cities they built above ground? In the climate-controlled vaults beneath the University of Pennsylvania Museum, dozens of clay fragments sit in labelled drawers: CBS 6894, CBS 12638, CBS 12757. Catalogue numbers assigned to pieces of humanity's oldest literature excavated from the ruins of Nippur between 1889 and 1900. These tablets, inscribed in cuneiform sometime between 1900 and 1600 BC during the Old Babylonian period, contain portions of a narrative that scholars initially categorized as mythology. A goddess descends, a goddess dies, a goddess returns. Yet when Samuel Noah Kramer began piecing together these fragments in the 1930s and 40s, comparing them against tablets held in the British Museum, the Louvre, the Yale Babylonian Collection, and the Schoyen Collection in Norway, something unexpected emerged. The text didn't read like allegory or symbolic poetry, it read like documentation. Line after line described specific procedures, exact sequences, precise instructions. The goddess wore 7 particular items, each with a technical name. She passed through 7 gates in a specific order. She gave her minister detailed emergency protocols, including a 3-day timeline and a hierarchical list of contacts. When the rescue succeeded, it followed a procedure so exact that it appears in nearly identical form across more than 50 separate source tablets excavated from different sites across Mesopotamia. This consistency troubled scholars. Myths evolve. They change with each telling, shaped by culture and context. But procedural records remain stable, especially when they document something considered important enough to preserve across centuries. Before we go further, take a moment to settle in. Comment below where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Let the question rest with you as you drift towards sleep. What were the Sumerians actually recording? The standard interpretation holds that Inanna's descent represents a vegetation myth, the cyclical death and rebirth of nature. Mainstream scholarship, following the work of Thorkild Jacobsen in his 1976 study The Treasures of Darkness, A History of Mesopotamian Religion, frames the narrative as theological metaphor, the goddess experiencing death to understand her power, to integrate her shadow, to claim dominion over all realms. This reading makes sense if you approach the text as literature composed by priests to explain seasonal change or religious ritual. It makes less sense if you read the text as the Sumerians themselves might have read it, as a record of their world, documented with the same administrative precision they applied to grain inventories, legal contracts, and astronomical observations. The tablets present a problem. They describe the underworld not as an abstract spiritual realm, but as a mapped location with geographical access, governed by laws, staffed by officials, and operating according to rules so rigid that even the Queen of Heaven could not bypass them. 7 gates, each manned by a chief doorman named Neti, a throne room where 7 judges called the Anunnaki passed sentence according to established procedure, a resurrection protocol that required specific materials, the life-giving plant, the life-giving water, and operatives who knew how to navigate the realm's restrictions. If this was mythology, why does it read like a procedural manual? The question deepens when you examine what Inanna claimed as her reason for descending. She told the gatekeeper Neti that she came to attend the funeral rites of Gugalanna. Yet the Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed on tablets that exist in both Sumerian and Akkadian versions, makes clear that Gugalanna died because Inanna herself demanded his release from her father Anu after Gilgamesh rejected her advances. The Bull of Heaven descended, Enkidu and Gilgamesh killed it, and Ereshkigal became a widow. Inanna was not an innocent mourner attending a funeral. She was, by the text's own account, complicit in creating the grief she claimed to honour. So why did she actually go? The oldest versions of the Descent narrative, preserved on tablets like MS 3281 from the Shoin collection, a 208-line-old Babylonian text from Lhasa dating to 1900-1700, provide no additional motive beyond the funeral excuse. But they do provide something else, a meticulous accounting of preparation, procedure and consequence. Inanna took the 7 divine powers. She collected the divine powers and grasped them in her hand. The text names each item: a turban for the open country, a wig for her forehead, small lapis lazuli beads, twin egg-shaped beads, a pala dress, mascara called Let a Man Come, a pectoral, a golden ring, and the lapis lazuli measuring rod and measuring line. This is not poetic embellishment. These are specific objects with technical names, and at each of the 7 gates, as Inanna descended, one was removed. By the time she reached the throne room, she stood naked, stripped not of symbolic power, but of actual equipment. What if the gates weren't metaphorical thresholds of transformation? What if they were decontamination checkpoints? What if the items removed were incompatible with the environment she was entering, and the stripping process was standard procedure for anyone attempting to cross between realms? The tablets suggest this possibility through what they don't say. At each gate, when Inanna asks, "What is this?" the gatekeeper replies, "Be satisfied, Inanna, a divine power of the underworld has been fulfilled. Inanna, you must not open your mouth against the rights of the underworld. Not you are being humbled or you are learning a lesson. Simply, this is procedure. Do not question the rights." When she reached the bottom, the 7 Anunnaki judges, named explicitly, consistently, across dozens of source tablets, looked at her. It was the look of death. They spoke to her. It was the speech of anger. They shouted at her. It was the shout of heavy guilt. And then, the text states with clinical precision, the afflicted woman was turned into a corpse, and the corpse was hung on a hook. No lengthy torture, no dramatic confrontation with her sister. A judicial sentence executed immediately, following a protocol the tablets present as routine. This is where the question shifts from why Inanna went to who brought her back. Because 3 days later, according to the exact timeline Inanna had specified in her instructions, 2 beings arrived in the underworld who should not have been able to enter at all. They had no bodies that could die. They made no sound as they moved. They accepted no offerings, demanded no tribute, acknowledged no authority except the mission they'd been given. The tablets call them the Korjara and the Gala Tura, creatures neither male nor female, fashioned by the god Enki from the dirt under his fingernails. And they succeeded where gods had failed, not through force, but through a protocol even the Queen of the Dead could not refuse. The story preserved on these clay fragments presents itself not as myth, but as record, as documentation of an event that, from the Sumerian perspective, actually occurred in a place that actually existed, following laws that actually applied even to the divine. What follows is an investigation of that possibility, not to prove it as fact, but to examine what the texts themselves suggest when we read them as the Sumerians might have, as archives of their world, preserved with care, intended to be understood. The geography of Kur. The Sumerian word for underworld is Kur. In the cuneiform script pressed into clay tablets throughout Mesopotamia, the sign appears as a vertical wedge topped by 3 horizontal strokes, a simple pictograph that carries remarkable specificity. Because Kur in Sumerian doesn't just mean underworld in the abstract sense of an afterlife realm, it means mountain or foreign land. The same word designates both the place where the dead go and the distant mountains beyond Sumer's borders, territories that exist, that can be reached, that have geography. This dual meaning matters. When the Sumerian scribes at Nippur inscribed the Descent of Inanna onto clay around 1900 BC, they used a term that their audience would have understood as referring to an actual location, not a spiritual dimension beyond the physical world, but a place beneath or beyond the known territories of civilization, accessible through specific routes, governed by its own rulers, operating under its own jurisdiction. The distinction between Sumerian cosmology and modern religious concepts of the afterlife cannot be overstated. Contemporary thinking separates the material world from the spiritual realm, body here, soul elsewhere, the afterlife as fundamentally different in nature from physical existence. The Sumerians made no such division. Their tablets describe the gods eating, drinking, sleeping, travelling between cities. They described the underworld as Ereshkigal's domain, a kingdom she inherited, staffed with doorkeepers and judges, and populated by the dead who still exist in recognisable form. When Inanna descends, she doesn't transcend to another plane of existence. She travels to another location. This literalism appears consistently in how the tablets describe access to Kur. Inanna doesn't pray her way into the underworld or achieve spiritual passage through meditation. She physically travels to the palace Ganza, arrives at an actual door, and aggressively pushes on it. The chief doorman Neti asks who she is and why she has come. She gives her reason, he leaves to consult his mistress, and he returns with instructions for processing her entry through a series of gates. The entire sequence reads like border control documentation. Geography reinforces this reading. The Sumerians built their civilization in southern Mesopotamia, the flatlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the water table sat high and the earth remained relatively level. They understood mountains as foreign, dangerous territories beyond their borders, the Zagros Mountains to the east, where hostile tribes lived in terrain Sumerians found difficult to navigate. The word Kur encompassed both the concept of these distant mountain regions and the realm of the dead, suggesting the underworld was understood as an extension of foreign geography rather than a separate dimension of existence. Temple records from Sumerian cities, including Nippur, and Uruk, contain references to the Kigal, literally Great Earth or Great Place, another term for the underworld that emphasizes its terrestrial nature. Ereshkigal's name itself combines Eresidi or Keen with Kigal, identifying her as Queen of the Great Earth. Her domain isn't heaven's opposite, it's Earth's continuation, the part beneath, the part beyond, the part where different rules apply but which remains continuous with the world above. This continuity explains why Inanna's journey required preparation but not transformation. She didn't need to shed her mortal body or transcend physical form. She needed to equip herself with items that would, presumably, function wherever she was going. The 7 objects she wore, the Mi, or divine powers, represented portable authorities, devices she could carry that would maintain her status and capabilities in foreign territory. When these were removed at the gates, she lost not symbolic power, but functional equipment. The location of Kur, according to patterns that emerge across Sumerian literature, seems to have been conceived as downward, but also outward. The journey took time. Inanna travelled with her minister Ninshaba following behind her. They didn't instantaneously appear in the underworld. They went there, the way one goes to another city, another country. The tablet specifies, Inanna travelled towards the underworld. Her minister Ninkubura travelled behind her, not descended in a flash of light, not teleported, travelled. When they arrived at Gansa, described in the tablets as Ereshkigal's palace, they found it guarded and gated. 7 gates specifically, each apparently marking a deeper level or more restricted zone within the underworld's territory. The repetitive structure of the gate passage in the descent narrative suggests these weren't arbitrary obstacles, but systematic security, each gate manned, each requiring authorization, each enforcing the removal of one piece of Inanna's equipment before allowing her to proceed deeper. This layered security model appears nowhere else in Sumerian mythology with such precision. When Gilgamesh travels to the ends of the earth seeking immortality, he encounters guardians and obstacles, but they test his worthiness through challenges, not bureaucratic procedure. When Enki travels to Eridu, he simply arrives. When Enlil moves between temples, the texts note his presence without describing checkpoints or inspections. The 7 gates appear unique to the Underworld, suggesting not a narrative device, but a documented feature of the place itself. Why 7 gates? The number 7 held significance throughout Mesopotamian culture. 7 planetary bodies visible to the naked eye, 7 ancient cities, 7 sages. But the gates don't function symbolically in the narrative, they function operationally. Each one must be passed. Each one has a doorman. Each one enforces a specific removal before permitting entry to the next level. The tablets even specify that Neti, after receiving instructions from Ereshkigal, bolted the 7 gates of the Underworld. Then let each door of the palace Gunza be opened separately, not all at once, separately, one by one, as if they could not all be opened simultaneously, as if the security system required isolation between zones. What kind of place requires such systematic control over entry? What kind of realm needs to strip visitors of their equipment piece by piece before granting access to its centre? The mainstream interpretation holds that the 7 gates represent stages of ego death, symbolic thresholds Inanna must cross to achieve psychological integration. She enters whole and emerges transformed through the dismantling of her constructed self. This reading, popularised by Jungian analysts and feminist scholars including Betty Deschamps-Midor in her 2000 work Inanna, Lady of Largest Heart, frames the descent as an internal journey mapped onto geographical metaphor. Yet this interpretation requires imposing modern psychological frameworks onto a text that nowhere mentions transformation, ego, or self-actualization. What the text actually says is simpler and stranger. Inanna went to a place. The place had rules. The rules required systematic removal of specific items. When she reached the centre without those items, she died. 3 days later, operatives who knew the protocols restored her to life. She returned. The place continued to exist. The rules remained in force. The system persisted. If we take the Sumerians at their word, if we read the tablets as they present themselves, as records rather than metaphors, then Ker was geography. It had location. It had rulers. It had infrastructure. 7 gates of unknown purpose but documented existence. Each one a checkpoint, each one enforcing restrictions that applied even to the most powerful goddess in the Sumerian pantheon. This raises uncomfortable questions about Sumerian civilization itself. They emerged suddenly around 4000 BC in southern Mesopotamia with fully developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, and complex administrative systems. Their earliest texts present these capabilities as inheritances from the Anunnaki, the those who from heaven to earth came, described in Sumerian literature not as metaphorical ancestors, but as the source of civilization's founding knowledge. The tablets treat the Anunnaki as real entities who governed both the world above and the world below, who established laws, who built cities, who assigned territories. In this framework, Ereshkigal wasn't an imaginary death goddess. She was an administrator of a territory beyond Sumerian borders, a place continuous with their world, but segregated by boundaries enforced through infrastructure. The gates weren't symbolic, they were actual. The procedures weren't ritualistic, they were functional. And Inanna's journey wasn't a hero's quest or a seasonal allegory. It was an incursion into foreign territory, unauthorized, resulting in her execution according to local law, followed by a rescue operation that exploited specific procedural vulnerabilities in the Underworld security system. The tablets preserve this sequence with documentary precision across more than 50 sources excavated from multiple sites. They don't frame it as extraordinary or supernatural. They frame it as an event that occurred, was documented, and was worth preserving across centuries of copying and transmission. Something happened that the Sumerians understood as real, something involving a place they called Kur, staffed by entities they named, operating according to protocols they recorded. The question isn't whether we believe in a physical underworld beneath ancient Mesopotamia. The question is what the Sumerians believed they were documenting when they carved these accounts into clay with such meticulous consistency. Because if this was fiction, it's fiction that maintained perfect procedural continuity across dozens of scribes, multiple cities, and more than 1,000 years of literary transmission. And if it was record, then it documents something far stranger than mythology, a civilization preserving detailed accounts of interactions with territories and authorities they understood as real as the rivers that watered their fields. The geography of Kur, as described in these tablets, suggests a place. The procedures documented for entering it suggest infrastructure. The consistency of these details across the entire textual tradition suggests the Sumerians were recording something they considered worthy of exact preservation. Not a story that could be altered to suit each generation, but an account that must remain accurate because accuracy mattered. What could matter enough to warrant such precision? What kind of place was Kur really that required travellers to be systematically stripped of equipment before reaching its centre? And what happened there that made it necessary to develop protocols for extracting those who died attempting unauthorised entry? The tablets don't answer these questions. They simply record that such a place existed, such protocols applied, and such an extraction was successfully executed following procedures that someone at some point had learned and preserved. The rest lies in inference and the unsettling precision with which these ancient scribes documented what they understood to be the structure of their world. All of it, not just the parts we would recognise as terrestrial today. The excuse that doesn't make sense. When Neti, the chief doorman of the Underworld, asks Inanna why she has travelled to the land of no return, she gives a specific answer preserved across every major version of the Descent narrative. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature composite text, drawing from more than 50 source tablets, records her reply at lines 85-89, because Lord Gudgalana, the husband of my elder sister Holy Ereshkigal, has died. In order to have his funeral rites observed, she offers generous libations at his wake. That is the reason. Gudgalana, the bull of heaven, dead. And Inanna, the goddess of love and war, has come to the underworld to pay her respects at his funeral, to honour her sister's grief with her presence at this solemn occasion. The explanation appears straightforward, motivated by familial duty and cultural obligation. Mesopotamian funeral customs, as documented in thousands of administrative texts excavated from Sumerian cities, involved elaborate rituals including libation offerings, mourning periods, and the presence of family members to honour the deceased. Inanna's stated reason aligns perfectly with expected behaviour for a sister attending the funeral of her brother-in-law. There's nothing inherently suspicious about it, except that Gudgalana's death, documented in the Epic of Gilgamesh on tablets including the Yale tablet and the standard Akkadian version compiled in Nineveh's libraries, didn't just happen, it was caused, and Inanna was the cause. The Gilgamesh epic, which exists in both Sumerian fragments and later Akkadian versions, describes the sequence. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, returns victorious from slaying Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest. His heroic status at its peak, he catches the attention of Inanna, called Ishtar in the Akkadian versions. She propositions him directly, "Come, Gilgamesh, be my lover, grant me your fruit. You will be my husband, and I shall be your wife." Gilgamesh, in what must rank among history's most catastrophic rejections, refuses. But he doesn't simply decline. He catalogues Inanna's previous lovers, and what became of them: Dumuzi the shepherd, condemned to death; Ishulanu the gardener, transformed into a mole; the lion, the stallion, the shepherd. each one used and discarded. Which lover did you love forever? He demands. Which of your lovers pleased you for all time? Inanna, enraged by this public humiliation, goes to her father Anu, the sky god, and demands that he release the bull of heaven to punish Uruk. When Anu hesitates, citing the destruction this will cause, Inanna threatens, "If you do not give me the bull of heaven, I will smash the gates of the netherworld, I will smash the doorposts and leave the doors flat, I will let the dead rise, and they will eat the living." This is not a grieving sister making a reasonable request. This is blackmail backed by a threat to collapse the boundary between the living and the dead. Anu capitulates. The bull of heaven descends. Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill it. And somewhere in the depths of Kur, Ereshkigal becomes a widow because her sister demanded the weapon that would cause her husband's death. The chronology here matters critically. Inanna tells Neti she has come to attend Gugalanna's funeral, but the texts provide no indication of how much time passed between the bull's death in Uruk and Inanna's arrival at the Underworld gates. The descent narrative begins, in most versions, with the line from the great heaven she set her mind on the great below. No context, no stated timeline, just Inanna deciding to descend and immediately beginning her preparations. This omission is unusual for Sumerian literature. Administrative texts from the period meticulously record dates, durations, and chronological sequences. Legal documents specify exactly when transactions occurred. Temple records note the day, month, and year of significant events. Yet the descent narrative provides no temporal markers connecting Gugalanna's death to Inanna's journey. We're given the excuse, attending the funeral, without any confirmation that a funeral was actually taking place when she arrived. Consider the practical problems with her explanation. Gugalanna died in Uruk, in the world above. His body would have been disposed of according to whatever customs applied to divine beings killed in combat. Ereshkigal lived in the underworld, separated from her husband by the boundary between realms. How exactly would a funeral be conducted? Who would attend? The underworld, as described in Sumerian texts, was populated by the dead. The living didn't travel there for social occasions. The entire premise of the descent narrative revolves around the fact that Kur was the land of no return, a place you didn't visit and come back from. Yet Inanna prepares for the journey as if it's a formal diplomatic visit. She doesn't arrive grief-stricken and distraught, rushing to comfort her bereaved sister. She carefully selects and dons 7 specific items, the me, divine powers, and gives her minister Ninshubur detailed instructions for what to do if she doesn't return. This is not the behaviour of someone going to a funeral. This is the behaviour of someone entering hostile territory with a specific objective and a contingency plan for extraction if things go wrong. What was her actual motive? One possibility, suggested by Thorkild Jacobsen and other scholars working in the mid-20th century, is that Inanna sought to expand her domain. She ruled heaven and earth, but Kur remained outside her authority, governed by her sister. Perhaps she intended to conquer the underworld, to add it to her territories, to establish herself as the supreme authority over all realms. The 7 divine powers she wore might have been not regalia for mourning, but equipment for taking control. The measuring rod and measuring line used by Mesopotamian administrators to claim and allocate land. This reading gains traction from the tablet's description of what happens when Inanna reaches the throne room. Line 164 states, "Then she made her sister Ereshkigal rise from her throne, and instead she sat on her throne. Not she approached her grieving sister with condolences, not she paid respects to the deceased. She forcibly displaced the rightful ruler and claimed the seat of authority." This doesn't read like attending a funeral, this reads like a coup attempt. Ereshkigal's response, ordering the Anunnaki judges to execute Inanna immediately, makes perfect sense in this context. An unauthorized entry into a secured territory, stripping of equipment at each checkpoint to prevent armed intrusion, arrival at the centre, an immediate attempt to seize the throne, followed by execution according to local law. The entire sequence follows a logical pattern if we understand it not as a goddess visiting family, but as an invasion that failed. But this interpretation introduces new problems. If Inanna intended conquest, why give Ninshuba rescue instructions? Why create a contingency plan that assumes her own death and requires divine intervention to restore her? Conquerors don't plan their own resurrections before battle, they plan victory. The existence of the rescue protocol suggests Inanna knew death was a likely outcome, perhaps the intended outcome of her descent. Another possibility, Inanna went to retrieve something, not to conquer Ker, but to recover an object or a person trapped there. The tablets don't specify what she sought, but they do specify that she took the 7 divine powers with her. What if these weren't weapons or tools of authority, but keys, equipment necessary to navigate the underworld's layers, with each item corresponding to one of the 7 gates? She would know she'd lose them on the way down. She'd plan for that. The question would be whether she could accomplish her objective after losing all her equipment and then somehow make it back out. This reading aligns with the tablet's repeated emphasis on the objects Inanna wore. Lines 14-25 catalogue them precisely. Lines 102-113 repeat the catalogue when Neti reports to Ereshkigal. Lines 129-163 describe their removal one by one. The narrative draws constant attention to these items as significant, as central to understanding what Inanna was doing. Yet if she simply went to attend a funeral, why would she need any of them? Why would their removal matter? Why would the text spend so much space documenting what was taken from her if these were merely symbolic adornments? The tablets preserve one additional detail that complicates every interpretation. Ereshkigal's reaction when she learns Inanna is at the gates. Lines 114-122 describe her response. When she heard this, Ereshkigal slapped the side of her thigh. She bit her lip and took the words to heart. This is not surprise. This is not grief at a sister coming to comfort her. This is alarm, anxiety, immediate strategic, thinking about how to handle an anticipated threat. Ereshkigal knew Inanna was coming, or at least she knew Inanna might come. Her instant decision: let the 7 gates of the underworld be bolted. Then let each door of the palace Ganza be opened separately. As for her, after she has entered and crouched down and had her clothes removed, they will be carried away. Reads like executing a prepared protocol, not improvising a response to unexpected visitors, but implementing existing procedures designed specifically for this scenario. Why would the Queen of the Underworld have established procedures for processing Inanna's entry? What history between these sisters made Ereshkigal anticipate this arrival and prepare for it with systematic countermeasures? The tablets don't say. They record only that Inanna gave an explanation, attending Gugalanna's funeral, that doesn't quite hold together under examination. They record that Ereshkigal responded not with welcome, but with a security protocol that systematically stripped Inanna of her capabilities before allowing her to the throne room. They record that when Inanna reached the throne, her first action was to displace Ereshkigal and claim the seat. And they record that this resulted in immediate execution by judicial order. Somewhere in this sequence lies Inanna's actual reason for descending. The funeral explanation functions as a plausible cover story, the kind of excuse that would make sense to a doorman checking credentials at a border. But the actions that follow, Ereshkigal's alarm, the systematic stripping, the attempted throne seizure, the execution, suggest something else was happening, something the tablets don't explicitly name but preserve in the structure of what occurred. We know this. Inanna caused Gugalanna's death. Shortly thereafter, she descended to the realm where Gugalanna's widow ruled. She came prepared with specific equipment and a rescue plan if things went wrong. She attempted to take Ereshkigal's throne. She died for it. 3 days later, precisely as planned, the rescue protocol she'd established was executed successfully. Whatever happened in Kur, whatever Inanna's true motive for going there, it was important enough to risk death. important enough to plan for resurrection, important enough to coordinate a complex extraction operation involving divine intervention and operatives who could navigate the underworld's restrictions, and important enough that when the Sumerians recorded it, they preserved the event with documentary precision while leaving the central question, why, answered only with an explanation that, examined closely, explains nothing at all. The excuse doesn't make sense, which suggests the truth was either too complex, too dangerous, or too incomprehensible to state directly. So the tablets record the sequence. She said she came for a funeral, she wore 7 specific items, she was systematically stripped at 7 gates, she seized the throne, she died, she was resurrected, she returned. The system persisted. And somewhere in that sequence lies a story the Sumerians preserved in action but not in explanation, an account of what happened documented with precision, while the reason it happened remains locked in the subtext of a funeral that may never have taken place at all. The 7 Me, what Inanna actually wore. Lines 1425 of the Descent narrative, preserved in remarkable consistency across source tablets, including MS3281 from the Shoin collection, and the Nippur fragments held at the University of Pennsylvania, catalogue exactly what Inanna wore when she began her journey to the underworld. The text doesn't describe these items as clothing or jewellery in general terms. It names them specifically using technical Sumerian vocabulary that designates particular objects with particular functions. First, she put a turban, headgear for the open country, on her head. The Sumerian term is yuga, headgear associated specifically with travel outside civilized territory. Not a crown denoting royal status, not a ceremonial headdress for religious occasions, a turban designed for the open country, territories beyond city boundaries, foreign land, places requiring different equipment than urban environments. Second, she took a wig for her forehead. Hair coverings in Mesopotamian culture carried administrative significance. Wigs weren't fashion accessories. They marked professional roles and social positions. Temple records from Nippur and document wages paid to wig makers, accounting for the cost of acquiring human hair and allocating wigs to specific temple personnel according to their functions. The wig Inanna wore designated something about her role or authority. Third, she hung small lapis lazuli beads around her neck. Lapis lazuli, imported to Sumer from Afghanistan through extensive trade networks, represented one of the most valuable materials in Mesopotamian civilization. It wasn't merely decorative. Lapis was used in temple foundations, administrative seals, and objects associated with divine authority. The specific mention of small beads suggests not a single statement piece, but multiple stones configured as a functional device. Fourth, she placed twin egg-shaped beads on her breast. Again, not jewellery described in aesthetic terms, but objects defined by precise shape and position. Egg-shaped, twin, positioned on the breast. The specificity implies function, not fashion. Fifth, she covered her body with a pala dress, the garment of ladyship. The pala dress appears throughout Sumerian administrative texts as official attire associated with specific roles. Temple records from the Ur-3 period document the allocation of pala garments to priestesses and administrative officials. This wasn't a generic dress, it was a uniform, an identifier of authority and function. Sixth, she placed mascara which is called let him come on her eyes. The Sumerian text preserves the actual name of this substance, numbarakar. Not mascara in the modern cosmetic sense, but a specific preparation with a specific name invoking approach or attraction. The dual naming in the text, calling it mascara while also preserving its technical designation, suggests this material had recognized properties beyond appearance enhancement. Seventh, she pulled the pectoral, which is called come over her breast. Similar to the mascara, this object carries both a functional description, a chest ornament or protection, and a specific name indicating purpose. The paired naming with the mascara, both invoking approach, suggests these items worked in conjunction, perhaps as part of a system. 8th, she placed a golden ring on her hand. Gold in Mesopotamia wasn't purely decorative. It was used in temple offerings, administrative transactions, and devices requiring specific conductive or protective properties. A golden ring on the hand occupies the position where administrative seals were worn, devices used to mark documents, open sealed containers, and verify authority. 9th, she held the lapis lazuli measuring rod and measuring line in her hand. This is the most explicitly functional item in the catalogue. Measuring rods and lines appear throughout Mesopotamian administrative texts as tools used by surveyors, architects, and officials claiming and allocating land. They weren't symbolic representations of authority, they were working instruments. The text specifies lapis lazuli construction, expensive, durable, and implying importance significant enough to warrant precious materials. That's 9 items, but the text refers to them collectively as the 7 divine powers, the me. This discrepancy between 9 named objects and 7 divine powers creates the first interpretive problem. Scholars have proposed various solutions. Perhaps some items should be counted as sets rather than individual pieces. The twin beads might count as one. The mascara and pectoral might function as a paired system counted together. The turban and wig might constitute a single unit of headgear. But the tablets don't clarify the grouping. They simply list 9 specific items and refer to them as 7 powers. The term me itself carries significant weight in Sumerian literature. Me were understood as fundamental principles of civilization, not abstract concepts, but portable, transferable authorities that could be possessed, stolen, or granted. The story of Inanna and Enki, preserved on tablets including those at the Morgan Library, describes how Inanna tricked Enki into giving her the me while he was drunk. She loaded them onto her boat and sailed away, bringing civilization's foundations to her city Uruk before Enki sobered up and realized what he'd lost. In that narrative, the me number more than 60, including such things as kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the art of prostitution, law, and many others. They're described as objects that can be physically gathered and transported. Enki collects them. Inanna loads them onto a boat. They have substance in the world, not just conceptual existence. The 7 divine powers Inanna wore to the underworld represented a subset of the total me, a specific collection selected for this particular journey. But which 7? And more importantly, what did they actually do? The tablets provide clues through what happens when these items are removed. At each of the 7 gates, Neti strips one piece of equipment from Inanna. The sequence proceeds from top to bottom, first the headgear, then the neck ornament, then the breast beads, then the pectoral, then the ring, then the measuring instruments, finally the dress. Each time Inanna asks, "What is this?" she receives the same response: "Be satisfied, Inanna, a divine power of the underworld, has been fulfilled." Inanna, you must not open your mouth against the rights of the underworld. A divine power of the underworld has been fulfilled. Not you are being stripped of power or you are losing authority, but a divine power of the underworld, a different category of me, belonging to Ker rather than to heaven and earth, has been fulfilled through this removal. As if the stripping process itself activated underworld protocols, each item's removal completing a requirement necessary to proceed deeper. This suggests the items Inanna wore weren't just tools she brought from above. They were incompatible materials that had to be removed in sequence to permit safe passage through the underworld's layers, like decontamination procedure, removing foreign substances before entry into a controlled environment. William W. Hallow, in his 1968 work The Exaltation of Inanna, published by the Yale Near Eastern Researchers, examined Mesopotamian royal regalia and its connection to divine authority. He noted that items like the measuring rod and ring appeared in royal iconography across millennia, held by gods and kings alike, always in contexts suggesting active function rather than passive symbolism. Shamash, the sun god, holds these instruments when dispensing justice. Ishtar holds them when receiving authority from Anu. They appear in boundary stones marking territory, in royal seals authenticating documents, in temple reliefs depicting divine administration. These weren't ceremonial props. They were working devices whose exact function has been lost to us, but which the Mesopotamians clearly understood as operational. The lapis lazuli construction is particularly notable. This semi-precious stone, prized throughout the ancient Near East, required extensive trade networks to obtain. Afghanistan's Badakhshan mines supplied the ancient world's lapis, meaning the material travelled thousands of miles to reach Sumerian craftsmen. The expense and effort involved in creating lapis lazuli measuring instruments indicates their importance exceeded decorative value. What properties does lapis lazuli possess that might have made it suitable for devices needing to function in the underworld? The stone contains pyrite crystals that produce a metallic shimmer, a golden appearance within blue matrix. It was ground into powder for ultramarine pigment, used in temple foundations, carved into cylinder seals that could survive millennia of use. Its durability and distinctive appearance made it ideal for objects requiring long-term functionality and immediate recognition. But the tablets don't explain why these particular materials mattered. They simply record that Inanna carried lapis lazuli instruments into the underworld, and that these were among the items that had to be removed before she could reach the throne room. Each of the 7 gates enforced one removal. By the 7th gate, Inanna entered naked. Lines 159163 describe the final stripping. When she entered the 7th gate, the paladress, the garment of ladyship, was removed from her body. What is this? Be satisfied, Inanna. A divine power of the underworld has been fulfilled. Inanna, you must not open your mouth against the rights of the underworld. Without the equipment she'd brought from above, Inanna reached the throne room and immediately attempted to take Ereshkigal's seat. The Anunnaki judges looked at her, spoke to her, shouted at her, and executed her. The text provides no indication she resisted or fought back. Perhaps she couldn't. Perhaps without the 7 divine powers, she had no capability to resist the underworld's authority. This raises the question, what would have happened if she'd kept the equipment? If she'd somehow bypassed the gates without being stripped, would she have had the capability to successfully seize control? Were the 7 me she wore functional devices that might have enabled conquest, making their systematic removal the only way to neutralize the threat she represented? The tablets don't answer. They record only the protocol. Entry requires sequential stripping. Each gate enforces one removal. Each removal fulfills a divine power of the underworld. The process is described as compulsory, ritualistic in its precision, but not explained in its purpose. When Inanna returns from death 3 days later, she doesn't recover the 7 items. The text doesn't describe her picking them up as she ascends through the gates. The divine powers remain in the underworld, presumably collected or discarded, their absence not noted as problematic for her return journey. This asymmetry is strange. If the equipment was necessary for entering, why not necessary for exiting? If the items represented Inanna's power and authority, how does she function without them after resurrection? One possibility: the 7 me she wore were single-use devices, meant to facilitate one-way passage. She didn't expect to retrieve them. The rescue plan Ninshibu executed didn't involve recovering Inanna's equipment. It involved restoring Inanna herself using different methods, the life-giving plant and the life-giving water that Enki provided to the Korjara and Galatura. Another possibility: The me belonged to heaven and earth, Inanna's domains. They couldn't function in Kur. The underworld operated under different principles, different divine powers, different me specific to that realm. Trying to use heaven's tools in Kur's territory was inherently futile, which is why the gates systematically removed them. They didn't work there. They couldn't work there. And everyone involved, Inanna, Ereshkigal, Neti, understood this, which is why Inanna didn't resist the stripping and why Ereshkigal ordered it completed fully before allowing Inanna to the throne. What remains clear is this. The tablets treat these 7 items as specific, functional, significant equipment. They're named precisely, they're catalogued completely, they're removed systematically, they're described with technical vocabulary that designates purpose, not decoration. And their absence, Inanna standing naked before the Anunnaki, directly precedes her execution. Whether the 7 me were tools meant to facilitate conquest, keys designed to open the gates, devices incompatible with underworld physics, or equipment whose true function we can no longer reconstruct, they mattered enough for the text to document them with meticulous detail across dozens of source tablets spanning more than 1,000 years of transmission. The Sumerians knew what these items were. They knew what they did. They preserved the names, the materials, the sequence of removal. What we've lost isn't the data. It's the context that made the data meaningful. The understanding of what divine powers actually were, how me actually functioned, and what Inanna thought she could accomplish by carrying heaven's tools into the territory of the dead. The tablets preserve the inventory. The instructions remain. These objects, in this order, must be removed at these gates, or passage cannot proceed. Somewhere in that procedural requirement lies a principle of how the underworld worked, what it required, and what it couldn't permit. The 7 divine powers represented something the underworld had to neutralize before allowing deep access. Something significant enough to warrant 7 sequential checkpoints. Something Inanna carried anyway, knowing she'd lose it all before reaching her objective. The equipment has names. The protocol is documented. The function remains mysterious, locked in Sumerian technical knowledge that died with the scribes who understood what they were recording when they pressed wedges into clay and catalogued, with precise vocabulary, exactly what the Queen of Heaven wore when she descended to Kur, and exactly what was taken from her before she died there. Ninshubur's protocol. Before Inanna descends to the underworld, she speaks to Ninshubar. Lines 2867 of the Descent narrative preserve these instructions in detail across multiple source tablets, including the Nippur fragments and MS 32281. The passage begins, Holy Inanna said to Ninkubura, "Come, my faithful minister of Eanna, my minister who speaks fair words, my escort who speaks trustworthy words." Then Inanna outlines a protocol. On this day I will descend to the underworld. When I have arrived in the underworld, make a lament for me on the ruined mounds. Beat the drum for me in the sanctuary. Make the rounds of the houses of the gods for me. This is the first layer, performative mourning. Ninshubur is to conduct public grief rituals, not privately, not quietly, on ruined mounds where the action will be visible, in sanctuaries where it will be heard, making rounds of temples where other divine authorities will notice. This isn't mourning for its own sake. This is signalling distress, creating public awareness that Inanna is missing, establishing a timeline that others can observe and verify. Lacerate your eyes for me, lacerate your nose for me. In private, lacerate your buttocks for me. Self-injury as part of mourning appears throughout Mesopotamian funeral texts, but the specificity here, eyes, nose, buttocks, and the distinction between public and private lacerations suggests more than cultural convention. This is visible proof of distress, injuries that cannot be hidden or faked. When Ninshubar later approaches the gods seeking help, they'll see the evidence of her mourning on her face. They'll know she's already completed the ritual requirements before making requests. The protocol establishes credibility. Like a pauper, clothe yourself in a single garment and all alone set your foot in the Kur, the house of Enlil. The instruction to dress as a pauper, stripping away status markers, approaching in humble presentation, serves a strategic function. Ninshubur is Inanna's minister, a powerful position. But when she enters Enlil's temple to beg for intervention, she doesn't come as an official making diplomatic requests. She comes as a supplicant, visually demonstrating that the situation has stripped away normal protocols. The single garment and solitary approach signal emergency status. Then the actual request is specified: when you have entered the Kur, the house of Enlil, lament before Enlil, Father Enlil, don't let anyone kill your daughter in the underworld. Don't let your precious metal be alloyed there with the dirt of the underworld. Don't let your precious lapis lazuli be split there with the mason's stone. Don't let your boxwood be chopped up there with the carpenter's wood. Don't let young lady Inanna be killed in the underworld. The language here is precise and metaphorical simultaneously. Inanna isn't literally made of metal, lapis lazuli, or boxwood. But the metaphors invoke degradation, contamination, destruction, precious materials ruined through improper treatment. Alloying metal with dirt reduces its purity and value. Splitting lapis with common stone destroys its integrity. Chopping boxwood with carpenter's tools wastes rare imported timber. Each image represents something valuable from the world above being destroyed by underworld conditions. The speech Ninshubur must deliver isn't a desperate plea. It's a formal argument structured around preservation of assets. Don't let your daughter frame Inanna as Enlil's possession, someone whose loss represents his loss. The material metaphors extend this. Allowing Inanna to remain dead in the underworld is waste, degradation, the ruining of something precious through improper handling. But Inanna doesn't expect Enlil to help. The instructions continue: if Enlil does not help you in this matter, go to Urim. She's already anticipating refusal and providing the next step. This isn't hope. This is procedure. When Enlil refuses, not if, but when, Ninshubur is to repeat the process at Nanna's temple in using identical language, making identical requests. And when Nanna also refuses, as Inanna apparently expects he will, the final instruction: go to Ereshkigal. In Ereshkigal, when you have entered the house of Enki, lament before Enki, 3 gods, hierarchical order: Enlil the king of gods, Nanna the moon god and Inanna's father, Enki the god of wisdom and fresh water. The sequence moves from highest authority to family to specialized knowledge, and Inanna's confidence appears entirely placed in the third option. Father Enki, the lord of great wisdom, knows about the life-giving plant and the life-giving water. He is the one who will restore me to life. This is prediction, not hope. Inanna states as fact that Enki possesses the means to resurrect her and will use them. She doesn't say maybe Enki can help or try asking Enki. She says Enki knows the materials required and will restore her. The protocol isn't designed to seek uncertain rescue. It's designed to activate a specific individual who has specific capabilities and will, apparently with certainty, deploy them when properly requested. The question becomes, how did Inanna know this? How did she know Enlil and Nanna would refuse? How did she know Enki would agree? How did she know Enki possessed life, restoring materials? And how did she know that these materials would function in the underworld to reverse death? The mainstream interpretation treats this sequence as narrative structure, the hero's journey, requiring multiple refusals before the true helper appears, building dramatic tension through repeated failure. But the tablets don't present it as dramatic. They present it as procedural. Ninshubur is given a checklist. Do these morning rituals. Approach these 3 gods in this order. Use this specific language. The third one will help. Proceed according to his instructions. This sounds less like a quest and more like filing a claim through administrative channels. First contact, highest authority. Expected outcome, rejection due to jurisdictional limitations. Second contact, family connections. Expected outcome, rejection due to same limitations. Third contact, specialized department with technical capabilities. Expected outcome, execution of rescue procedure. The 3-day timeline matters here. Inanna tells Ninchuba, when I have arrived in the underworld, make a lament for me. Not if I die, but when I arrive. As if death is inevitable, automatic upon reaching Ku's centre. And the timeline begins immediately. Ninchuba doesn't wait to see if Inanna returns safely. She begins mourning protocols as soon as Inanna enters the underworld. 3 days. Lines 173-175 specify, after 3 days and 3 nights had passed, her minister Ninkubura carried out the instructions of her mistress. Exactly 3 days. Not approximately, not after some time. 3 days and 3 nights, then Ninchuba activates the rescue protocol. Why 3 days specifically? Decomposition timelines, bureaucratic processing requirements. The tablets don't explain. They simply document that Inanna specified this duration. Ninchuba observed it precisely, and the rescue procedure that followed succeeded in restoring Inanna from death. When we examine what Ninchuba actually does, following Inanna's instructions exactly, the sequence reads like a manual being executed step by step. Lines 176-182. She made a lament for her in her ruined houses. She beat the drum for her in the sanctuaries. She made the rounds of the houses of the gods for her. She lacerated her eyes for her. She lacerated her nose. In private, she lacerated her buttocks for her. Like a pauper, she clothed herself in a single garment, and all alone she set her foot in the Kur, the house of Enlil. Perfect compliance. Every instruction followed. The public mourning, the self-injury, the costume, the solitary approach, all performed exactly as specified. Then the speech to Enlil, Father Enlil, don't let anyone kill your daughter in the underworld. Don't let your precious metal be alloyed there with the dirt of the underworld. Don't let your precious lapis lazuli be split there with the mason's stone. Don't let your boxwood be chopped up there with the carpenter's wood. Don't let young lady Inanna be killed in the underworld. Word for word repetition of Inanna's specified language, not Ninchuba's own plea, not improvised desperate begging. The exact phrases Inanna told her to use, delivered precisely. Enlil's response, lines 190-194. In his rage, Father Enlil answered Ninkubura, my daughter craved the great heaven, and she craved the great below as well. Inanna craved the great heaven, and she craved the great below as well. The divine powers of the underworld are divine powers which should not be craved, for whoever gets them must remain in the underworld. Who, having got to that place, could then expect to come up again? This isn't refusal based on inability, this is refusal based on principle. Enlil isn't saying he can't help, he's saying the underworld operates under rules that prohibit return. Anyone who goes there stays there. That's how it works. Inanna knew this and went anyway, so she must accept the consequences. The divine powers of the underworld, different from the divine powers Inanna wore, apparently, include a rule: entry is permanent, exit isn't permitted. Ninchuba proceeds to approaches Nana, delivers identical language, receives identical refusal. Lines 204-208 repeat Enlil's response, word for word from Nana. My daughter craved the great heaven, and she craved the great below as well. Inanna craved the great heaven, and she craved the great below as well. The divine powers of the underworld are divine powers which should not be craved, for whoever gets them must remain in the underworld. Who, having got to that place, could then expect to come up again? Two gods, same response, same reasoning. The underworld's rules prohibit extraction, the case is closed. Yet Ninchuba follows the protocol to its third stage. At Eridu, Enki's city, something changes. Lines 217-225 record his response. What has my daughter done? She has me worried. What has Inanna done? She has me worried. What has the mistress of all the lands done? She has me worried. What has the hierophant of An done? She has me worried. Not rage, worry, not rejection based on principle, concern about what Inanna has done. And then, without Ninchuba having to convince him, Without negotiation or bargaining, Enki immediately creates a solution. He removed some dirt from the tip of his fingernail and created the Korjara. He removed some dirt from the tip of his other fingernail and created the Galatura. To the Korjara, he gave the life-giving plant. To the Galatura, he gave the life-giving water. Instant response. Specialized operatives created specifically for this mission. Materials provided. Instructions delivered. No hesitation. No debate about whether the Underworld's rules permit this. Enki simply proceeds as if he knows exactly what to do, possesses the means to do it, and accepts the necessity of doing it. This contrast is striking. Enlil and Nanna refuse on principle, the rules say no. Enki bypasses the rules by creating operatives who aren't subject to them and providing materials that function despite the restrictions. He doesn't argue that Inanna deserves rescue. He doesn't challenge the Underworld's authority. He engineers a technical solution that works within the system's constraints. The protocol Inanna gave Ninshubur anticipated this entire sequence. She knew who would refuse and why. She knew who would help and how. She knew exactly what language to use, what order to follow, and how long to wait before beginning. The instructions weren't a desperate hope that someone might save her. They were an operational manual for executing a planned extraction. This level of foreknowledge raises profound questions. If Inanna knew she'd die in the Underworld, and knew she could be resurrected through Enki's intervention, why did she go at all? What was important enough to die for when death was a planned phase of the operation rather than a risk she hoped to avoid? The tablets don't explain her motive, they preserve the protocol. 3 days, public mourning, specific lacerations, hierarchy of divine contacts, exact language for requests. Third contact succeeds, specialized operatives deployed, resurrection materials provided, return achieved. Ninshubur executed the protocol perfectly, every step completed as instructed, and it worked exactly as Inanna apparently knew it would. The question isn't whether the rescue succeeded. The tablets document success clearly. The question is how Inanna possessed this knowledge beforehand, complete understanding of Underworld rules, divine jurisdictions, resurrection procedures, and timeline requirements, detailed enough to give her minister a step-by-step manual that functioned perfectly when executed precisely. This wasn't improvisation. This wasn't hope. This was protocol, documented procedure, a system someone had designed and Inanna knew how to activate. The Sumerians preserved it with the same precision they preserved legal codes and administrative procedures, not as story, but as record of how a specific operation was successfully executed according to plan. The gods who refused. When Ninshubur approaches Enlil in his temple at Nippur, following Inanna's instructions precisely, she makes her plea, Father Enlil, don't let anyone kill your daughter in the Underworld. The language explicitly frames the request as preventing murder, calling Enlil father to invoke his relationship to Inanna, appealing to his authority to intercede in what she presents as an injustice occurring in foreign territory. Enlil's response, preserved at lines 190-194, cuts through the emotional appeal with administrative clarity. My daughter craved the great heaven, and she craved the great below as well. Inanna craved the great heaven, and she craved the great below as well. The divine powers of the Underworld are divine powers which should not be craved, for whoever gets them must remain in the Underworld, who, having got to that place, could then expect to come up again. This isn't a father refusing to help his daughter. This is an administrator acknowledging jurisdictional boundaries. Enlil, whose name means Lord Wind or Lord Storm, functioned in Sumerian theology as the executive authority among the gods, the one who decreed fates, assigned territories, enforced cosmic order. His temple at Nippur, the Eker, served as the religious and administrative centre of Sumer for millennia. Thousands of tablets excavated from Nippur document the city's role as neutral ground, where the pantheon's decisions were formalised and recorded. Enlil's authority, extensive as it was in heaven and on earth, apparently didn't extend to Kur. His response makes this explicit. The underworld has its own divine powers, its own me, separate from and incompatible with the divine powers that govern the world above. Inanna craved both sets. She wanted authority over all realms. But the underworld's me include a foundational rule. Entry is permanent. Those who go there don't return. Who, having got to that place, could then expect to come up again? Not it would be difficult, or she doesn't deserve rescue. But this is how it works. The question is rhetorical, expressing logical impossibility. Going to the underworld means staying in the underworld. That's the rule. Enlil isn't refusing to help because he's cruel or indifferent. He's refusing because he recognises he has no authority to overturn the underworld's laws. Inanna entered Ereshkigal's territory. Ereshkigal's rules apply. Enlil's jurisdiction ends at the boundary. This jurisdictional interpretation gains support from Mesopotamian administrative practices documented across thousands of economic and legal texts. Sumerian city-states operated as independent territories, each governed by its patron deity, each with its own laws and administrators. When disputes arose between cities, they were resolved through councils, negotiations, treaties, not through unilateral intervention by higher authorities. Even Enlil, despite his paramount position, didn't simply override local governance. He functioned more as chairman of a council than absolute monarch imposing will by fiat. The underworld, in this framework, wasn't just symbolically separate. It was administratively autonomous. Ereshkigal governed Kur as independent territory. Her court, her laws, her officials held authority within her domain. External powers couldn't simply demand she release prisoners or reverse executions. Doing so would violate the fundamental structure of governance that maintained order across all realms. Enlil's refusal, then, represents not moral failure, but administrative integrity. He acknowledges limits. He respects boundaries. He recognises that the underworld's divine powers, while foreign to his authority, are nonetheless legitimate within their territory. Inanna chose to enter that territory. She subjected herself to its laws. Those laws have been applied. The case is closed. The text emphasises this by having Nanna, Inanna's father, give an identical response. Lines 204-208 repeat Enlil's words exactly. My daughter craved the great heaven, and she craved the great below as well. Inanna craved the great heaven, and she craved the great below as well. The divine powers of the underworld are divine powers which should not be craved, for whoever gets them must remain in the underworld. Who, having got to that place, could then expect to come up again? Word for word repetition across two different gods. This isn't coincidence or narrative laziness. This is documentary emphasis. The same law stated by two separate authorities confirming consensus, demonstrating that the principle isn't one god's opinion but recognised policy across the pantheon. Nanna, as Inanna's father, might be expected to show partiality, to prioritise family bonds over administrative procedure. Yet he gives the same response as Enlil, not because he doesn't care about his daughter, but because the situation admits no alternative. The underworld's rules are what they are. Personal relationships don't override jurisdictional law. This consistency highlights the anomaly of Enki's response. When Nippur makes the same plea to Enki at Eridu, his reaction breaks the pattern. Lines 217-225 record, "What has my daughter done? She has me worried. What has Inanna done? She has me worried. What has the mistress of all the lands done? She has me worried. What has the Hierodule of An done? She has me worried." Not the rules say no, not whoever goes there stays there, but worry about what Inanna has done. Present tense worry, not grief for past events. As if what concerns Enki isn't that Inanna died, but what action she took that led to her death, and what consequences that action might have beyond her personal fate. Then, without Nippur saying anything beyond her initial plea, Enki creates a solution. No negotiation, no weighing of options. He immediately fashions two creatures from the dirt beneath his fingernails, gives them the life-giving plant and the life-giving water, and dispatches them to the underworld with detailed instructions for infiltrating Ereshkigal's throne room and extracting Inanna's corpse. Why does Enki help when Enlil and Nanna refuse? The mainstream interpretation suggests a hierarchy of compassion. Enlil is stern and rule-bound, Nanna is disappointed in his daughter's choices, but Enki is wise and merciful, understanding that Inanna's descent serves necessary purposes beyond her conscious intent. This reading, common in Jungian and feminist analyses of the myth, frames Enki as the enlightened father figure who sees what others miss, that Inanna's journey represents essential transformation, that her death and resurrection serve cosmic function, that preventing her return would disrupt natural cycles. But this interpretation requires importing concepts, psychological transformation, archetypal patterns, cyclical necessity, that appear nowhere in the tablets themselves. The text doesn't describe Enki as seeing deeper meaning. It describes him as being worried about what Inanna has done and knowing how to reverse her death despite the underworld's rules prohibiting return. An alternative reading, Enki helps not because he's compassionate, but because he possesses technical knowledge the others lack. His titles in Sumerian texts include Lord of the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean, and Lord of Wisdom. The Abzu, described in Mesopotamian cosmology as the source of freshwater springs and wells, existed beneath the earth, spatially positioned below the surface world, but distinct from Kur. Enki's domain, in other words, occupied an intermediate position between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. This spatial relationship might explain his unique capabilities. Enlil governs the air and storm. Nanna governs the moon and celestial cycles. Neither has direct access to underground realms, but Enki's territory connects to the underworld through shared subterranean geography. The fresh water that flows to the surface through springs originates in the Abzu, which exists beneath and possibly adjacent to Kur. Enki, dwelling in this realm, might have knowledge of access routes, boundary protocols, and the materials that function in underground environments. The life-giving plant and life-giving water he provides aren't described as divine gifts from heaven. They're materials Enki possesses, apparently keeps on hand, as resources available in his domain. He doesn't have to create them or quest for them, he just has them, as if they're natural products of the Abzu, substances with properties that function in underground realms because they originate there. When he creates the Kurjara and Golatura from the dirt beneath his fingernails, he's using Abzu materials, substances from his domain, to fashion operatives who aren't subject to underworld law because they don't fit into categories that law recognizes. They're not divine, not human, not properly alive in the sense that would make them subject to death. They're constructs made from dirt, animated for specific purpose, existing in a categorical ambiguity that lets them slip through restrictions designed to constrain other types of beings. This isn't mercy, this is engineering. Enki identifies a technical problem, how to extract a corpse from the underworld when the underworld's laws prohibit exit, and implements a technical solution, create operatives the laws don't recognize as prohibited, provide them with materials compatible with the underworld's environment, brief them on infiltration procedure, and send them to execute the extraction. The text supports this reading by describing Enki's solution in procedural rather than emotional language. After creating the operatives and giving them the necessary materials, he instructs them exactly how to proceed. Go and direct your steps to the underworld, flit past the door like flies, slip through the door pivots like phantoms. This is infiltration protocol, not rescue Inanna because she deserves life, but bypass the gates, avoid detection, access the throne room through the following procedure. The instructions continue for dozens of lines, specifying exactly what the operatives should say when they encounter Ereshkigal, how they should respond to her suffering, what offers they should refuse, what requests they should make, and how they should revive Inanna once they obtain her corpse. Enki doesn't send the Korjara and Galatura with vague hopes and general encouragement. He sends them with a detailed operational plan that addresses each phase of the mission. This implies prior knowledge. Enki knows how Ereshkigal will behave, knows what she'll offer, knows how the Anunnaki will respond, knows the procedure for corpse extraction, knows how the life-giving plant and water function to reverse death. How does he know these things? How does he possess materials that function in the underworld? How can he create beings that slip through the underworld's laws? And why doesn't he simply tell Enlil and Nanna, here's how it can be done, rather than letting them refuse Ninshuba before implementing his own solution? One possibility, what Enki does technically violates the underworld's sovereignty, and he needs plausible deniability. If Enlil or Nanna authorize the extraction, it would represent official intervention by heaven's authorities in Kur's jurisdiction, a political act that might trigger conflict or set precedent for further interference. But if Enki acts independently, creating unauthorized operatives who exploit loopholes in the underworld's laws, then the extraction remains technically illegal, but not officially sanctioned by the Pantheon's leadership. This would explain why Inanna's protocol required Ninshuba to approach 3 gods in sequence. The first 2 refuse on record, establishing that heaven's authorities respect the underworld's autonomy. The third implements an off-book solution that accomplishes the goal without creating official precedent. Enki helps, but not in a way that obligates Enlil to acknowledge the help, or creates expectation that such extractions will be routinely authorized. Another possibility, Enki and Inanna had an understanding beforehand. Perhaps Inanna's entire plan required Enki's cooperation, secured before she descended. She gives Ninshuba detailed instructions, knowing they'll lead to Enki because she's already arranged for Enki to execute the rescue. Enlil and Nanna's refusals aren't obstacles to overcome. They're steps in the protocol, necessary rejections that establish the extraction as unauthorized by official channels before Enki implements the technical solution. This would make Inanna's descent something closer to a covert operation. Enki provides the exit strategy. Inanna executes the mission, whatever it actually was, dies in the process as expected, and the pre-arranged extraction proceeds according to plan. The 3-day timeline, the specific gods to contact, the exact language to use, all of it coordinates with Enki's readiness to respond, ensuring the window between Inanna's death and bodily deterioration remains brief enough for resurrection to succeed. The tablets don't confirm this interpretation explicitly, but they preserve enough detail to show that Enki's response wasn't improvised, wasn't based on new information Ninshuba provided, and didn't require him to obtain materials or develop methods on the spot. He already knew what to do and had the means to do it immediately available. His worry when Ninshuba arrived wasn't "I wonder if she survived," but what has she done, past tense completed action, concerned not about her death, but about whatever she accomplished before dying. The contrast between the gods who refused and the god who helped reveals a pattern. Official authority acknowledges limits, respects jurisdiction, maintains order by recognizing boundaries. Technical knowledge, operating in gaps between official channels, accomplishes what formal authority cannot. Enlil and Nanna represent the system working as designed. Enki represents specialized capability working around the system when necessary. All 3 responses were correct according to their roles. Enlil and Nanna maintain the principle that underworld law applies in the underworld, that jurisdictional boundaries must be respected, that even the King of Heaven doesn't override local governance. Enki maintained that certain technical capabilities exist independent of jurisdictional politics, that knowledge creates options formal authority can't access, and that the rules defining what's possible aren't necessarily the same as the rules defining what's authorized. Inanna's protocol anticipated all of this. She structured the sequence to hit each role in correct order, knowing the first 2 would refuse on principle and the third would succeed through technical means. The fact that she knew this beforehand suggests she understood the divine pantheon not as family drama, but as administrative structure, a system with rules, procedures, jurisdictional boundaries, and technical workarounds for those who know where to find them. The gods who refused maintained order, the god who helped circumvented it, and the goddess who descended apparently understood the difference well enough to design a protocol that leveraged both. The creatures made from dirt. Lines 217-225 describe Enki's solution with unusual specificity. He removed some dirt from the tip of his fingernail and created the Korjara. He removed some dirt from the tip of his other fingernail and created the Galatura, not clay from the earth, not sacred materials from his temple, dirt from beneath his fingernails, residue, trace material, the accumulated substance of his own contact with his environment. And from this he fashions two beings. The Sumerian terms Korjara and Galatura have generated scholarly debate since Samuel Noah Kramer first assembled the complete descent narrative in 1951. Kur means underworld or mountain, the same word designating Ereshkigal's territory. Gala refers to a type of priest associated with lamentation rituals, but the full compound terms don't translate cleanly into English categories. Most translations settle on creatures neither male nor female, emphasizing their ambiguous gender status. But this may be missing something more fundamental. These beings don't fit into any recognized category at all. They're not gods, they weren't born, they have no parents, they possess no divine domains, they're not human, they have no mortal lineage, no cities, no need for food or water. They're not demons or monsters, they serve no destructive function, carry no inherent malice. They're constructs, purpose-built for a specific mission, animated by Enki's intention, and then sent to execute a task that requires beings who exist outside the categories that underworld law recognizes. Enki gives the Korjara the life-giving plant. He gives the Galatura the life-giving water. The text doesn't describe these materials in detail, but their name suggests function. One restores biological processes, the other provides vital essence. Together they constitute a resurrection technology, materials that, when applied to a corpse, reverse the state of death. The instructions Enki provides span lines 226-253, detailing infiltration protocol with precision that suggests prior knowledge of the underworld's layout, security and personnel. Go and direct your steps to the underworld, flit past the door like flies, slip through the door pivots like phantoms, not go to the gates and request entry, not present yourselves to the doorman, bypass the official entrance entirely, move like flies, small, difficult to track, accessing spaces through gaps rather than doors, move like phantoms insubstantial, passing through barriers designed to stop physical beings. The creatures Enki made from fingernail dirt apparently possess these capabilities inherently. They're designed for infiltration. The instructions continue. The mother who gave birth, Ereshkigal, on account of her children, is lying there. Her holy shoulders are not covered by a linen cloth. Her breasts are not full like a kagan vessel. Her nails are like a pickaxe upon her. The hair on her head is bunched up as if it were leeks. This is intelligence briefing. Enki knows Ereshkigal's current state, physically compromised, in mourning, uncovered, dishevelled. How does he know this? The text doesn't say, but the detail is sufficient for the operatives to understand what they'll encounter. A ruler in distress, not at full power, vulnerable to specific approach. Then the operational procedure, when she says, "O my heart," you are to say, "You are troubled, our mistress, O your heart." When she says, "O my liver," you are to say, "You are troubled, our mistress, O your liver." This is empathy protocol. Mirror her language. Acknowledge her suffering. Don't offer solutions or judgment. Just reflect what she expresses. The Korjara and Galatura aren't sent to negotiate or fight. They're sent to connect emotionally with someone in grief, someone whose pain has made her guards drop. When Ereshkigal asks who they are, they're instructed to make her swear by heaven and earth before answering. Then refuse her offers. They will offer you a river full of water. Don't accept it. They will offer you a field with its grain. Don't accept it. Refuse everything except one thing. Give us the corpse hanging on the hook. The mission is extraction, nothing more. Get in, connect with Ereshkigal. Refuse all inducements except the corpse. Apply the life-giving plant and water. Extract Inanna. The entire operation depends on beings who can bypass physical barriers, who aren't subject to the Underworld's rules about entry and exit, and who can establish rapport with the Queen of the Dead through simple empathetic witnessing. Lines 254-262 confirm the infiltration succeeded. The Galatura and the Korjara paid attention to the instructions of Enki. They flitted through the door like flies. They slipped through the door pivots like phantoms. They didn't fight guards or break locks. They simply entered spaces that weren't designed to constrain beings like them. When they encounter Ereshkigal exactly as Enki described, they execute the empathy protocol precisely. Lines 263-272 show the exchange working. When Ereshkigal expresses her pain, they mirror it. They don't try to comfort or fix or distract. They simply acknowledge, "You are troubled, our mistress." This approach succeeds where force would fail. Ereshkigal, moved by their recognition of her suffering, asks who they are and offers them rewards. They refuse the water and grain, asking only for the corpse. And Ereshkigal, bound by the oath they made her swear, gives it to them. They were given the corpse hanging on the hook. One of them sprinkled on it the life-giving plant, and the other the life-giving water. And thus Inanna arose. No dramatic battle, no negotiation with the Anunnaki judges, no confrontation with Neti or the gate system. The operatives bypassed all official channels, connected with the one person who had authority to release the corpse, and obtained it through empathy rather than force. Then they applied the resurrection materials, and Inanna lived. This raises the question, could Enki himself have gone to retrieve Inanna? Why create intermediaries? Perhaps because gods are subject to the Underworld's rules in ways these constructed beings aren't. Perhaps because Enki entering Kur would constitute official divine intervention, while sending creatures made from fingernail dirt remains technically deniable. Or perhaps because the extraction required beings who could genuinely empathise with Ereshkigal's grief without agenda or judgment, something gods, with their politics and hierarchies and jurisdictional concerns, might not be able to do authentically. The Korjara and Galatura had no stake in divine politics. They were made for this mission and nothing else. They could witness Ereshkigal's pain without trying to use it, manipulate it, or judge it. And that purity of purpose apparently gave them access where official channels had closed. The 7 gates as decontamination. The repetitive structure of Inanna's passage through the 7 gates has led most interpreters to read these as symbolic thresholds, stages of ego dissolution, layers of false identity stripped away to reveal essential self. But the tablets describe something more procedural than symbolic. At each gate, a specific item is removed following a specific sequence. Each removal triggers the same response from Neti, be satisfied. Inanna, a divine power of the underworld, has been fulfilled. Not you are being purified, or you are learning humility, but a divine power of the underworld has been fulfilled. Something specific to cause operation has been completed through this removal. Each item taken represents a step in a process that must be completed fully before entry to the centre is permitted. Consider the practical implications. 7 sequential checkpoints, each one requiring the removal of one piece of equipment before passage to the next level. This is security architecture, compartmentalized access, systematic screening, prevention of unauthorized materials from reaching inner zones. Modern clean rooms use similar principles: remove street clothes in the first chamber, don protective gear in the second, pass through air showers in the third, each stage reducing contamination before entry to controlled environment. What if the 7 gates function similarly? What if the items Inanna wore, materials from the world above, constructed of substances like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, gold from unknown mines, textiles from above ground production, were incompatible with the underworld's environment? Not symbolically incompatible, but physically so, requiring systematic removal before she could survive and cause deeper regions. The sequence moves from outer to inner, from head to feet. First the turban and wig, headgear for travelling in open country. Then the neck beads, lapis lazuli, imported from distant mountains. Then the breast ornaments, twin beads of unknown material. Then the pectoral, metal or stone worn over the chest. Then the ring, gold on her hand. Then the measuring rod and line, lapis lazuli instruments. Finally the pala dress, the garment covering her entire body. By the 7th gate, Inanna stands naked. Everything from above has been removed. She enters the throne room, wearing nothing from the world of the living, carrying no equipment from heaven's domains, stripped of all substances that originated outside Kur's boundaries. Only then do the Anunnaki judges see her. Only then can their look, their speech, their shout take effect. As if the items she wore would have interfered with the judgment process, as if the 7 divine powers she carried might have functioned as protection or interference that had to be removed before underworld law could be properly applied. This reading finds support in what happens when Inanna returns. The text doesn't describe her recovering the 7 items as she ascends. They remain in the underworld, presumably collected at the gates, disposed of or stored. Inanna exits without them. She doesn't need them for the return journey. The decontamination only functions in one direction, removing materials from above before entering below. Coming back up apparently requires no equivalent screening, unless the life-giving plant and water functioned as substitutes, unless the resurrection materials Enki provided replaced whatever qualities the 7 divine powers had possessed, transforming Inanna into something compatible with both realms, capable of passage without requiring protective equipment. The gates themselves, 7 layers between the surface and Ereshkigal's throne, suggest depth, not symbolic stages, but actual distances, each gate marking a deeper level of descent. The Palace Ganza, where Inanna first arrives, appears to be the surface entrance. From there, she passes through 7 secured zones before reaching the centre, where Ereshkigal rules and the Anunnaki judge. Neti, the chief doorman, controls this entire system. He doesn't merely guard one gate. He manages all 7, opening each one separately after receiving authorization from Ereshkigal, enforcing the removal protocol at each stage. This suggests centralized security, one administrator overseeing compartmentalized access, ensuring procedure is followed precisely before permitting progression to the next level. The bolting and unbolting sequence is specified. Let the 7 gates of the underworld be bolted. Then let each door of the Palace Ganza be opened separately. All gates locked first, ensuring complete security. Then each opened individually, one at a time, never leaving multiple access points unsecured simultaneously. This is protocol designed to prevent unauthorized entry, maintain control over movement between zones, and ensure that anyone reaching the centre has been properly processed through every checkpoint. What was being protected? What required such systematic security? The throne room where Ereshkigal sat and the Anunnaki judged existed at the bottom of this layered system, accessible only after passing through 7 controlled zones. Whatever happened in that central chamber, whether judgment, administration or something else, was sufficiently important to warrant infrastructure designed to screen anyone attempting access, the Anunnaki judges and the Look of Death. When Inanna reaches the throne room, stripped of all equipment from above, she immediately attempts to displace Ereshkigal and claim the seat of authority. The text records this at line 164. Then she made her sister Ereshkigal rise from her throne, and instead she sat on her throne. The response is immediate and coordinated. The Inanna, the 7 judges, rendered their decision against her. They looked at her, it was the look of death. They spoke to her, it was the speech of anger. They shouted at her, it was the shout of heavy guilt. 3 actions: looking, speaking, shouting. 3 effects: death, anger, guilt. The sequence progresses from perception to judgment to sentence. And the result, the afflicted woman, was turned into a corpse. And the corpse was hung on a hook. No physical violence is described. No weapons, no struggle. The Anunnaki look, speak, shout, and Inanna dies. The text presents this as judicial procedure, not combat. 7 judges rendering decision, executing sentence through, means that function like law enforcement rather than warfare. Who were the Anunnaki? The term appears throughout Sumerian and Akkadian literature, designating divine entities associated with judgment, fate, and underworld authority. Earlier texts describe them as sky gods, children of Anu. Later texts place them in the underworld as judges of the dead. The Descent narrative positions them explicitly as Ereshkigal's court, 7 judges who assess cases and render binding decisions. Their number, 7 matching the 7 gates, suggests systematic organisation, not a random assembly of authorities, but a structured court, perhaps with each judge corresponding to one of the 7 zones Inanna passed through, each representing jurisdiction over specific domains or types of cases. The look of death implies capability beyond metaphor. If looking at someone could kill them, this suggests either technology we no longer understand or principles of reality the Sumerians documented that don't align with our physics. The tablets treat this as straightforward cause and effect. They looked, death resulted. They spoke, anger manifested. They shouted, guilt was pronounced. Each action produced its intended outcome with predictable efficiency. This procedural language, rendered decision, looked, spoke, shouted, turned into corpse, hung on hook, reads like court documentation. The tablets preserve not a mythological battle, but a legal execution following proper channels. Inanna committed an offence, unauthorised entry, stripping at the gates, suggesting arrest procedure, attempted seizure of the throne constituting clear violation. The court convened, assessed the case, and rendered sentence according to underworld law. The sentence was death, executed immediately, with the corpse displayed on a hook. This detail, hanging the body, suggests either storage, warning, or both. Perhaps all those who violated underworld law were hung on hooks, creating a gallery of violators as deterrent. Perhaps the hook served practical purpose, keeping corpses accessible for whatever processing the underworld required. Or perhaps it ensured the dead stayed dead, preventing escape or resurrection without authorized intervention. The Anunnaki's authority appears absolute within their jurisdiction. They judged, they executed, they displayed the result. No appeals process is mentioned. No review by higher authority. Within Ker, their decision was final. Yet 3 days later, the Kurjara and Galatura obtained Inanna's corpse from that hook and reversed the Anunnaki's sentence. This suggests either the judge's authority ended once sentence was executed, or the creatures Enki sent operated in a space the judges couldn't constrain. The Anunnaki could kill Inanna through their look, speech, and shout, but they apparently couldn't prevent her corpse from being taken or stop the life giving plant and water from reversing death. Perhaps because resurrection wasn't their jurisdiction. Their authority was judgment and execution. What happened to bodies after death fell under different rules, managed by different authorities. Ereshkigal, not the Anunnaki, granted permission to take the corpse. The judges had completed their function. The rest fell outside their domain. Ereshkigal's grief. The instructions Enki gave the Kurjara and Galatura describe Ereshkigal in physical distress. Shoulders uncovered, breasts not full, nails like pickaxes, hair bunched like leeks. This isn't queenly presentation. This is someone in acute suffering, possibly childbirth or illness, unable to maintain normal appearance or function. Lines 226-235 specify she's in this state on account of her children, though the text doesn't clarify what this means. Is she giving birth, mourning dead children? The ambiguity has generated scholarly debate, but the essential point remains: Ereshkigal is vulnerable, in pain, alone in her distress, despite being queen of the underworld. When the Kuajara and Galatura witness her suffering and mirror it back, "You are troubled, our mistress," they don't offer solutions. They don't minimize her pain or contextualize it or try to fix it. They simply acknowledge it. And this acknowledgement succeeds where force or argument would fail. Ereshkigal responds to their empathy by offering them rewards, water, grain, whatever they want. But they refuse everything except the corpse. This refusal is significant. They're not there to gain resources or negotiate deals. They're there for one specific objective, and they won't be diverted from it even when the Queen of the Dead offers inducements. Yet they obtain what they came for because they first gave Ereshkigal what she needed: recognition of her suffering. Not sympathy, which maintains distance, but empathy, feeling with her, mirroring her expression, validating her experience without trying to change it. This exchange reveals something unexpected. The Queen of the Underworld, who ordered Inanna's execution, who presides over the realm of the dead, who judges the deceased according to ancient law, is herself in profound pain. She's not a villain enjoying Inanna's suffering. She's a ruler doing her job while enduring personal anguish that none of her authority or power can alleviate. The contrast between Ereshkigal and Inanna becomes striking here. Inanna arrived wearing 7 divine powers, attempting to seize the throne, meeting her death through immediate judicial sentence. Ereshkigal sat on that throne in dishevelled grief, shoulders uncovered, maintaining her authority while experiencing suffering that the text presents without judgment or resolution. Perhaps this is why Ereshkigal executed Inanna so quickly. Not cruelty, but recognition that the throne Inanna tried to take came with costs Inanna didn't comprehend. Ereshkigal wasn't protecting privilege. She was protecting Inanna from a burden that brought even its current holder to the edge of endurance. When the Kuajara and Galatura request the corpse and Ereshkigal grants it, she's bound by the oath they made her swear. But perhaps she's also relieved. Perhaps having someone witness her suffering, acknowledge it without trying to fix it, gave her the capacity to release Inanna's body when the formal request was made. The empathy protocol Enki designed succeeded because it recognized what others missed. The Queen of the Dead is also a person in pain. Authority doesn't eliminate suffering. Power doesn't prevent grief. And sometimes the only way through is someone simply bearing witness without agenda. The price of return. Inanna's resurrection creates an immediate problem. Lines 282-289 record, Inanna, because of Enki's instructions, was about to ascend from the underworld. But as Inanna was about to ascend from the underworld, the Inanna seized her. Who has ever ascended from the underworld has ascended unscathed from the underworld. If Inanna is to ascend from the underworld, let her provide a substitute for herself. The law is explicit. No one leaves without replacement. Return requires exchange. The underworld maintains equilibrium. A body leaves only if a body stays. Inanna can't simply walk out restored to life. Someone else must take her place. This rule wasn't mentioned when she entered. It emerges only when she attempts to leave, suggesting it's not about entry, but about exit. Anyone can go to the underworld. The problem is coming back. That requires balance, compensation, equivalent exchange. 7 demons accompany Inanna as she ascends, tasked with finding and claiming her substitute. The text describes them: those who accompanied her, those who accompanied Inanna, know no food, know no drink, eat no flour offering, and drink no libation. They accept no pleasant gifts. They never enjoy the pleasures of the marital embrace, never have any sweet children to kiss. These aren't beings who live in conventional sense. They're enforcers, collectors, existing only to maintain the underworld's law about substitution. They don't eat, don't drink, don't reproduce, don't experience pleasure. They serve one function, ensuring the balance is maintained. Nippur, who executed the rescue protocol perfectly, is the first person Inanna sees. The demons immediately move to take her, Inanna. Proceed to your city, we will take her back. But Inanna refuses. Nippur performed her duties faithfully, mourned correctly, secured Inanna's rescue. Taking her would be unjust. The same happens with Shara in Umma and Lulal in Bad Tibera, loyal followers who honoured Inanna during her absence, performing appropriate mourning rituals. Each time, Inanna rejects them as substitutes. The demons accept her decision and move on. Then they reach Uruk and find Dumuzi, Inanna's husband, dressed magnificently and sitting on a throne, not mourning, not performing rituals, not showing any sign of distress about Inanna's absence. He appears to have claimed her position and status, enjoying authority while she was dead in the underworld. Inanna's response is immediate and absolute. How much longer? Take him away. She doesn't hesitate. The husband who showed no grief, who seemingly stepped into her absence as opportunity rather than tragedy, becomes the substitute. The demon sees him, and Inanna returns to the world of the living, while Dumuzi descends to take her place. The text preserves this, without commentary on whether Inanna's choice was just. It simply records what happened. The law required substitution. Inanna protected those who mourned her faithfully and condemned the one who didn't. The system processed this selection without moral judgment, accepting the substitute and permitting Inanna's permanent return. Later texts, including Dumuzi's dream, describe Dumuzi fleeing the demons, his sister Geshtinanna helping him hide, and eventually a compromise where Dumuzi spends 6 months in the underworld while Geshtinanna volunteers to spend the other 6 months in his place. This creates the cycle. Half the year Dumuzi lives, half the year he descends, half the year Geshtinanna descends, half the year she returns. This resolution transforms the substitute requirement from permanent to cyclical. The underworld gets its balance. Someone always occupies the position Inanna's return created, but the someone rotates, dividing the burden between two people who share it willingly rather than one person bearing it eternally. The substitute law reveals something crucial about how the underworld operates. It's a closed system. Population must remain constant. Energy must balance. Every exit requires an entrance. This isn't cruelty. It's physics, the rules governing a realm that exists in equilibrium, where disturbance must be compensated or the entire structure destabilizes. Geshtinanna's sacrifice. Geshtinanna doesn't appear in the initial descent narrative. She emerges in related texts describing what happened after Dumuzi was taken. When the demons pursue her brother, she helps him hide. When they torture her to reveal his location, she refuses. Her loyalty costs her everything, yet she maintains it. The final resolution. Dumuzi and Geshtinanna, alternating 6-month periods in the underworld, represents compassion within rigid law. The substitute requirement can't be eliminated, the balance must be maintained, but the burden can be shared, distributed across time, made bearable through relationship. This suggests the underworld's laws, severe as they appear, contain flexibility. Not in their fundamental requirements, substitution must occur, balance must be maintained, but in how those requirements can be satisfied. Geshtinanna's voluntary assumption of half the burden transforms permanent death into cyclical absence, making the system sustainable for those who love each other enough to share the cost. The seasonal implications are obvious. Dumuzi's 6 months below correlate with agricultural dormancy, his return with growing season. Geshtinanna's alternation creates the pattern. But this agricultural reading, while valid, risks obscuring something stranger. These tablets describe specific people making specific choices that result in a specific arrangement. The seasonal cycle emerged from individuals negotiating with underworld law, not from abstract natural forces, requiring mythological explanation. Inanna's choice, volunteering to share her brother's fate, represents something the Underworld's system apparently permits: willing substitution. The demons didn't take her by force, she offered, and the arrangement was accepted as satisfying the balance requirement. One person permanently replaced becomes two people alternating indefinitely, different structure, same equilibrium. The Akkadian version, what changed? More than 1,000 years separate the Sumerian tablets excavated from Nippur and the Akkadian version preserved on British Museum tablet K162. Samuel Noah Kramer, comparing these versions in his 1951 analysis, noted significant differences. The later Akkadian tells fundamentally the same story, but alters crucial details. In the Akkadian Descent of Ishtar, the goddess's motivation is clearer. She explicitly seeks to conquer the underworld and claim its authority. The Sumerian version's ambiguous funeral excuse becomes overt ambition in the Akkadian text. This shift makes Ishtar more aggressive, less sympathetic, transforming her journey from potentially justified into clearly unauthorized power grab. The rescue sequence changes too. The Akkadian version reduces Enki's role, sometimes crediting the Akkadian equivalent, less prominently, or attributing the rescue to different divine intervention. The creatures he creates receive different descriptions, their gender ambiguity sometimes clarified or explained in ways that reduce their liminal status. Most significantly, the Akkadian version emphasizes the consequences of Ishtar's return more dramatically. The demons accompanying her are described with greater horror. Tammuz's Rimziv fate receives more attention. The text moralizes more explicitly about the costs of ambition and the justice of consequences. These changes reflect cultural evolution. The Akkadians, who absorbed Sumerian civilization after 2000 BC, inherited the stories but interpreted them through different values. The Sumerian version preserves procedural documentation with minimal moral commentary. The Akkadian version transforms documentation into narrative with clearer heroes, villains, and lessons. What remains constant across both versions: the 7 gates, the systematic stripping, the death sentence, the 3-day timeline, the rescue through empathy, the substitute requirement. The core structure persists even as interpretation shifts. This consistency across vast temporal and cultural distance suggests these elements were considered too essential to alter, either because they were understood as factual record that must be preserved accurately, or because changing them would make the story incomprehensible to audiences who knew. The canonical version, the pattern across texts. More than 50 cuneiform tablets and fragments preserve portions of Inanna's descent. They span over 1,000 years, originate from multiple cities, and represent dozens of scribes copying and recopying the narrative. Yet the core sequence remains remarkably stable, from great heaven to great below, 7 divine powers warned, 7 gates passed, death before the Anunnaki, 3-day interval, rescue by ambiguous creatures, resurrection and return, requiring substitution. This consistency is unusual for ancient literature. Myths typically evolve, incorporating local variations, adapting to cultural changes, reflecting each generation's concerns. The Epic of Gilgamesh exists in multiple versions with substantial differences. The Enuma Elish creation story shows regional variations, but Inanna's descent maintains procedural integrity across its entire transmission history. What does this preservation pattern suggest? Either the Sumerians and their successors considered this story sacred canon that couldn't be altered, or they understood it as documentation that must remain accurate to retain meaning. Religious texts get interpreted and adapted, historical records get preserved precisely. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature's composite version, assembling fragments from the University of Pennsylvania, the British Museum, the Louvre, Yale, and the Shoyan collection, demonstrates how scholars reconstruct these narratives. When tablets break or deteriorate, losing sections of text, other copies fill the gaps. The result is composite certainty. We know what the narrative said because dozens of sources confirm it. each preserving overlapping portions that align with remarkable consistency. This methodology reveals something crucial. The Sumerians weren't casually transmitting entertaining stories. They were deliberately preserving specific information across generations. The effort required to train scribes, produce clay tablets, maintain libraries, and copy texts repeatedly indicates these weren't disposable cultural products. They were archives, records considered important enough to maintain despite the labour involved. Inanna's descent appears in this archive alongside administrative records, legal codes, astronomical observations, mathematical texts, and medical procedures. It sits within a literature of documentation, a civilization recording what it knew, what it observed, what it considered true about its world. Not a mythology section separate from factual records, but integrated into the same corpus of knowledge the Sumerians preserved as their understanding of reality. This context invites reconsideration. What if the tablets document not theological metaphor, but procedural reality, a record of an event that occurred in a place the Sumerians understood as real, following rules they documented with precision, involving entities they named explicitly, and resolved through methods they preserved across centuries because accuracy mattered? We can't reconstruct the Sumerian worldview completely. We've lost the context that made their documentation fully meaningful. But we have the data, specific tablets with specific catalogue numbers, exact sequences preserved across multiple sources, technical vocabulary, designating precise items and procedures, and a transmission pattern suggesting deliberate preservation of accurate information rather than flexible storytelling. The pattern across texts points to documentation. The precision points to importance. The consistency points to something the Sumerians believed must not be altered, must not be lost, must be transmitted exactly to future generations regardless of cultural change or political upheaval. Whether what they documented was historical event, procedural knowledge, or theological truth beyond our categories, they treated it as information worth preserving with documentary precision. They recorded it as they recorded everything else they considered true about their world, carefully, specifically, maintaining accuracy across time, because they understood these tablets as archives of knowledge, not collections of entertaining fictions. Somewhere in the vaults beneath the University of Pennsylvania, in the British Museum's storage, in the Louvre's collections and the Shoyan Archive, these tablets rest, clay marked with wedges pressed 4,000 years ago, preserving an account the Sumerians considered worth the extraordinary effort of perfect preservation, an account of descent, death, rescue, and return, an account of the underworld not as metaphor, but as mapped territory with laws, gates, officials, and procedures, an account of what happened when the Queen of Heaven went to the realm of the dead and how she came back, written in cuneiform, preserved in clay, transmitted across millennia, still asking us to consider, what were they actually recording? And what does it mean that they recorded it with such unwavering precision, as if accuracy mattered more than anything else, as if they were preserving not a story, but the truth as they understood it, documented for anyone who might one day wonder what the Sumerians knew about the structure of their world and what existed beyond the boundaries of the light. The tablets remain. The precision persists. The question waits in the wedges pressed into clay. What did they see that required such careful preservation? And what might we see if we read their documentation as they wrote it, not as mythology to be interpreted, but as record to be understood?